All right, welcome to Part C of Lecture 19, Currency and Banking in Japan and the Ottoman Empire in the 19th Century. So there's a map of Japan in East Asia. Well, in the 1850s, after nearly 2 centuries of strict isolationism, Western powers forcibly open up Japan to the outside world, beginning with U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry in 1852, and then in the late 1850s, the British, the Russians, and French also negotiate treaties with the Japanese. Now, the shogunate was in charge of Japan at the time, a feudal military governor with feudal lords of a fairly decentralized way of governance throughout the islands underneath him. And this shogunate at first had come to power with Japan fully integrated into the global trade system. You'll recall the Iwami mines of Japan were opened up in the 1540s, these vast silver mines. The Portuguese initially dominated this trade of silver from Japan to China after the 1540s. Then, after the 1630s, the Dutch got in the game. The Dutch East India Company dominated the trade of silver between Japan and China. But then in the 1660s, the shogun just abruptly ended this trade and isolated Japan for almost 200 years. Well, Japan again is opened up. And then, shortly after that, in 1868, the Japanese emperor is fully reestablished. The Meiji Restoration, Meiji meaning enlightened rule. And Japan, after 1868, does a complete 180 and goes from this extreme xenophobia, we might call it today, and extreme isolationism, to a period of just rapid imitation of what Western imperial powers are currently doing, rapid acceptance of new technology. And after 1868, Japan and the Japanese government truly aspires to be a just fully capitalist, industrialist, imperialist power. And Japan largely succeeds in that goal and establishes herself as an imperial power in East Asia in her own right. Well, all this is going to require money, and so the Japanese state was very smart and recognized that they needed to formalize and sophisticate their own currency and financial system. In 1871, the Japanese government established a unit of account called the yen. The yen, and of course the Japanese yen remains the unit of account in Japan. The yen was defined both in gold and silver, and so this is a bimetallic coinage. The yen was initially defined as 1.5 grams of gold or 24.5 grams of silver. The following year, in 1872, the Japanese government passed the National Bank Act, and the National Bank allowed for national banks to across Japan to be constructed and to issue banknotes redeemable on demand in silver or gold yen. There's a gold yen, of course. Lovely coin. So bimetallic coinage, silver and gold. And banknotes. At first, these were competitive banknotes. This National Bank Act actually was modeled after the National Banking Acts that had been passed in the United States during the Civil War. We haven't gotten to that yet in this course. We will later. But it was that was the model for this Japanese system after 1872. And even the notes themselves were imitated. This was a national banknote in the United States in the 1860s and 1870s, and the Japanese literally took that template and made their own national banking notes. Well, after about a 10-year period of competing national banks and different banknotes, the Japanese government decided to settle on a single bank that would have a monopoly of note issue, and that was the Bank of Japan. Established in 1882, this Bank of Japan was given a monopoly on issuing paper banknotes in order to help stabilize the yen. Man, some of these notes are pretty awesome. I love looking at old banknotes and all just the symbols and the colors, and really fascinating stuff. Well, this currency and banking reformation in Japan went a long way in financing Japanese industrialization. Take a look at some of these numbers here. By 1900, Japan was producing 20 times more coal than they were in 1875. Steamships, a sign of industrialization. Japan had 26 in 1873. By 1913, 1,500. Or look at this, miles of railroad track. In 1872, there were only 18 miles of railroad track in Japan. By the eve of World War I, there were over 7,000 miles of railroad track. Railroads, of course, are very, very capital-intensive projects. You need banking, you need borrowing, you need finance, high finance for railroad building, and Japan has that infrastructure. Without the financial infrastructure in place, this would not have been possible. And then in 1897, almost as if to signal to the rest of the world that we've arrived, we're an imperial power, we're a first-rate imperial power on the same level as all the other major European powers, the Japanese government abandons bimetallism and adopts a full-fledged gold standard after 1897. Now, there were still some silver coins. It was more of a subsidiary coinage. Japan goes gold in 1897. So Japan is one of the exceptions. It's an exception as far as industrialization, and the currency reflected that. All right, let's take a look at the Ottoman Empire. Another exception, but in a different way. Now, the Ottoman Empire, by this point in time, was nicknamed the sick man of Europe. We have a large empire, but one that really since the late 17th century, and especially in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, had suffered just this debilitating stagnation and all sorts of problems. Now, the coinage here, predominantly silver. These are coins from the 18th century. Ottoman coins from the 18th century. Silver, but also some gold, but mostly silver coinage. The big turning point in Ottoman history was the Battle of Vienna in 1683. The Ottomans had expanded their conquests all the way up to the door of Central Europe. The battle at Vienna, Polish and Austrian forces combined to push back the Ottomans. By 1699, the Ottomans had lost all their territory in Central Europe. And then, beginning in the latter decades of the 18th century, the Ottomans suffered a series of 4 wars against Russia, each of which they lost. Russia lost all 4 of these Russo-Turkish wars Russia won all 4 of these Russo-Turkish wars between 1768 and 1829. The Ottomans had to surrender a lot of territory, especially on the northern fringes around the Crimean Sea. It wrecked many of the Ottoman finances. And by the early 1800s, the Ottomans are steadily debasing their coinage. The Ottoman sultans were very careful not to become indebted to foreign powers. They didn't want to borrow heavily from European countries because they feared, rightly so, that if the Ottoman government became indebted to Europe, that Europe would effectively control them and be able to tell them what to do. And so instead of borrowing and contracting all this foreign debt, you couldn't tax much more than the Ottomans already were doing without causing some sort of rebellion or unrest within the country. They went the roundabout way and just debased their coinage. Silver coin, the main unit of account went from 25 grams of silver down to 3 grams of silver. Then in 1853, a new war erupted between the Ottomans and the Russians, the Crimean War. But this time the Ottomans had help. Britain and France joined on the side of the Ottomans. The reason for this, Britain was very concerned about Russian ambitions in the Near East and in Central Asia. Russia loses this war. The Ottomans technically win. The treaty is signed in 1856. However, the fact that they needed British and French help required it, really, to win this war, meant that some concessions to the British and French. And sure enough, that same year, 1856, a bank is established in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Bank. But it's not totally controlled by the Ottoman government. Rather, it was a joint venture. Yes, the Ottoman government was involved, but also British and French investors. British and French investors get involved in this bank. And now we've opened the door now to some Western influence in Ottoman finances. The Ottoman Bank issued banknotes, a few Ottoman banknotes, introducing this new form of finance to the empire. So, by the 1870s, the Ottomans suffer further debilitation on the world stage. Greece had already become independent of Ottoman control back in the 1820s, but there were new independence movements in the Balkan region, which was still under Ottoman control. The Serbs, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, and in the mid-1870s, 1875 and 1876, some of the persecuted Christian populations in the Balkans revolted against Ottoman rule. This revolt, long story short, inspires a new war with Russia in 1877, a new Russo-Turkish War. And the Russians start off the war with smashing victories and begin, march right through Bulgaria and begin marching toward Constantinople, what today is Istanbul. And it looks like the Russians are going to take Constantinople. It looks like the Ottoman Empire might be totally dissolved. There's an interesting map from the period. There's Russia. Well, Britain and France, especially Britain, freak out at this prospect of Russia taking Constantinople and having access to the Near East and to the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the European powers, led by Britain, intervene in the matter, sort of force a conference in Berlin. And again, long story short, the Ottomans are saved from destruction. So the Ottoman Empire remains an empire. And now the Ottomans are really indebted to the British, to the French. And just a couple years later, in 1881, under pressure from foreign bondholders, from the British and French primarily, the Ottomans adopt a gold standard. Okay? Now this might sound strange because on one hand, doesn't a gold standard signal that a country or an empire has arrived and is a first-rate power? In this case, no. In this case, no, because it wasn't a full-fledged gold standard. It was de jure only. Okay? What it meant, this gold standard, was that any foreign investors, foreign bondholders from Britain, France, any part of Europe, would be paid in gold. All debts would be denominated in gold. Major foreign transactions would take place in gold. And that was the defining unit of account. And that's how the unit of account was defined. So the Ottoman government couldn't pay in a debased silver coinage. In reality, most ordinary people did not use gold in regular exchange, but used some silver, but also a lot of copper and nickel coins. This is a nickel coin. And this was the predominant coin used by ordinary Ottoman people. But on the books, it was a gold standard. In reality, not so much. There's a copper coin. This was the currency of ordinary people in the Ottoman Empire. So, that wraps things up. Silver standard outside of Europe. Gold in Europe. Gold in Japan. And gold in the Ottoman Empire for major stakeholders and major investors. And people who transacted business or dealt with the Ottoman government. We'll see the United States. The United States, there will be a big battle. Should we go gold or silver or bimetallism? And it will erupt into this major, major political conflict in the 1890s. Wait on that. We're going to get to it. But in Japan, gold signaled their rise. And ironically, in a strange way, in the Ottoman Empire, the gold standard signaled the further stagnation and further decline of the Ottoman Empire, since it was imposed on them virtually by European powers. And then in the rest of the colonial world, in Africa and in Southeast Asia, and then in China and India and Latin America, Persia, the silver standard dominates. So that concludes our lecture 19. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time for lecture 20. We are now going to hone in on the United States. The United States, the U.S. dollar. When I see you for lecture 20, we'll dive right into George Washington's administration and a battle between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson over whether or not the federal government has a right to charter a bank of the United States. That'll come next time for lecture 20. See you there.